I bet you didn't notice the new game day lineup that just dropped in the shop. Picture this kettle chips paired with a tart, savory lingonberry sauce. It's unexpected, but it works. Grab your snacks for the game with delivery in under 15 minutes. Now let's step back in time. It's September 28th, 1849. The streets of Baltimore are slick with autumn dampness. A print worker named Joseph Walker is heading out for a drink. As he approaches Ryan's Tavern on Lombard Street, he stops. There's a man lying in the street gutter. He's dressed in cheap, filthy, ill-fitting rags. He looks entirely lost to the world. Walker steps closer, kneels down, and asks the stranger if he has any friends or family in the city who could help him. The delirious man manages to mumble the name and address of a local medical journal editor. Walker immediately scribbles a note and sends it off. It reads, "Dear Sir, there is a gentleman rather the worse for wear at Ryan's Ward Polls who goes under the cognomen of Edgar A. Poe and who appears in great distress." It really was him. The great American writer. The man history would label a dark genius. The undisputed architect of American Gothic literature. And the father of genres we now take for granted. Writers like Jorge Luis Borges, H.P. Lovecraft, and Ray Bradbury would eventually call him their master. Others would simply call him a madman and a drunk. Almost no one feels neutral about Edgar Allan Poe. You either revere him or you despise him. But who is the man behind the shadow? What parts of his story are cold, hard facts, and what is just a carefully constructed myth? Tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain. Let's start with a little historical vignette. In 2016, a library in Charlottesville, Virginia, threw a public reading to celebrate the 190th anniversary of Edgar Allan Poe's arrival in town as a student. The man hosting the event was none other than the undisputed king of modern horror, Stephen King. Standing at the podium, King pointed out a simple truth very few writers in the history of the written word have handed literature as many groundbreaking, foundational ideas as Poe did in his brutally short life. First off, Poe was the guy who looked at literature and decided to make the villain or the madman the main character. He essentially invented the anti-hero. It was a trend that would slowly infect the 19th century, dominate the 20th, and completely wire the television shows we binge today. Before Poe, storytelling was simple. You had the good guy in the white hat and the bad guy in the black hat. Today we demand complex narrative arcs. We look at a killer on screen and say, well, yeah, he's a monster, but what made him that way? What's his trauma? That entire psychological shift in how we view the antagonist, that starts with Poe. He didn't just bend genres, he built them from scratch. The Gothic romance, the supernatural thriller, the psychological detective story, the architecture of modern horror, none of it exists without his blueprints. Agatha Christie, Arthur Conan Doyle, and Stephen King himself were all just walking down the path that Poe cleared with a machete. Over the last 180 years, his collections have sold roughly 100 million copies worldwide. He sits comfortably in the top 50 most studied authors on Earth. First editions of his early poetry are among the rarest, most fiercely guarded books on the planet. But history has a sick sense of humor. Almost all of this global adoration arrived after his heart stopped beating. He lived for just 40 years, and he spent almost all of them in crushing, suffocating poverty. The French poet Charles Baudelaire once wrote that Poe's life was an astonishing, unrelenting chain of miseries and bad luck. Some of those tragedies were handed to him by fate. Others he engineered himself. His story begins as an immigrant story. His grandfather fled Ireland, running from the brutal overreach of British rule and the creeping shadow of famine, seeking refuge in America. Poe's father, David, was supposed to become a respectable lawyer. Instead, he got bitten by the theater bug, ran away from home, and married a young actress named Elizabeth. They were both around 19 years old. They moved to Boston, where Edgar was born as the middle of 3 children. Poe lost the genetic lottery when it came to his father. David was a heavy drinker who constantly missed rehearsals until the theater finally fired him. The family was plunged into such desperate poverty that the father pawned off the eldest child to the grandfather in Baltimore and then simply vanished. Maybe he drank himself to death in an alley. Maybe he joined a merchant crew and drowned at sea. Nobody knows. He just faded out of existence. By 1810, a third child, a girl named Rosalie, was born. The constant starvation, stress, and absolute terror of their living conditions broke Elizabeth's immune system. She contracted tuberculosis and died shortly after. The children were suddenly orphans. Friends and relatives divided them up like leftover furniture. Edgar was only 2 years old. He was taken in by Frances Allan, a woman who had done some amateur acting herself. Her husband, John Allan, was a wealthy, hard-nosed merchant who traded in tobacco and cotton. The couple couldn't have children of their own, so they brought the toddler home. This brings us to the very first myth about Edgar Allan Poe. The idea that he was a miserable, abused orphan who spent his childhood locked in cold, loveless rooms, which is why he wrote such dark stories. The truth is, his foster mother Frances adored him. She raised him as her own flesh and blood. But his relationship with his foster father, John Allan, was ice cold. John never officially adopted the boy. Still, to his credit, he made sure Edgar received a top-tier education. Poe would later become famous for ripping his plots straight from the daily newspaper. His story, The Mystery of Marie Roget, actually holds the title of the very first piece of fiction based on a true crime. He changed the names and moved the setting from New York to Paris, but the actual police evidence dictated his plot. He was publishing it serially in a magazine, and he literally had to delay the 3rd installment because real-life witnesses suddenly came forward with new testimony, and Poe had to rewrite his ending to match reality. Great stories are built on unexpected plot twists, and that's true in real life too. In the story of modern finance, the biggest twist has been the massive evolution of digital banking. It's no longer just about standard telecom or old-school banking. It's about frictionless financial services. Right now, with a few taps in a digital app, you can open a virtual digital card and start earning 5% cash back on your daily expenses. We're talking transit, groceries, and dining out, all just by paying via QR code, with cash back maxing out at a solid amount every single month. Plus, there are heavy discounts on premium mobile plans. You can spin up one of these virtual cards instantly right from your phone. Click the link I've left for you down in the description, get your card set up, and start pulling in that cash back today. Back to the timeline. In 1815, right after the War of 1812, the United States economy tanked. The Allan family felt the squeeze and packed their bags for Great Britain, hoping John could rebuild his fortune in Liverpool and London. Young Edgar was shipped off to a boarding school. For the next 4 years, he lived under the strict, watchful eye of a headmaster named Reverend Bransby. Years later, the Reverend would recall, "I liked the boy, poor fellow. His parents spoiled him terribly." Edgar, however, viewed the Reverend as a rigid, unbearable hypocrite. He would later immortalize the man's worst traits in his haunting psychological thriller about doppelgangers, William Wilson. By 1819, Frances Allan fell ill. The family's British business ventures were bleeding money, so they retreated to America, renting a house in Richmond, Virginia. For a few months, Edgar was a teenager with too much time on his hands, but when he returned to school, his sheer intellect took over. He was a natural at mathematics, obsessed with the poetry of the ancient Greeks, and showed a brilliant, undeniable flair for the written word. He was the kid everyone thought was going to be someone. At 13, he started writing poetry. Mostly he wrote verses for the girls attending a nearby finishing school run by a woman named Mrs. Mackenzie, the same woman who was raising his biological sister, Rosalie. Legend has it that Edgar would use his sister as a courier, passing hand-drawn pencil portraits and sweets to the girls he had crushes on. But back home, the atmosphere was suffocating. John Allan, the man who refused to give Edgar his last name, wrote a letter to a friend that perfectly encapsulates the eternal grueling war between a father and a teenager. He complained that the boy did nothing for him, moped around the house, and looked perpetually angry. "What have we done to deserve this?" John wrote. "The boy shows not a shred of gratitude, even though I've given him an education far beyond my own." It's the classic generational divide. Parents provide the baseline of survival and expect a marching band of gratitude. Kids view the baseline as exactly that, a baseline, and don't feel the need to applaud. By 1825, a 16-year-old Edgar fell hard for a local girl named Sarah Royster. They were so deeply involved they were secretly planning to get married. But John Allan saw an opening to finally get rid of his moody, ungrateful foster son. He packed Edgar up and shipped him off to Thomas Jefferson's newly founded University of Virginia in nearby Charlottesville to study Latin, Greek, and French. School had always been a breeze for Poe. He was a rock star in the lecture halls. Professors were baffled by his photographic memory. He could stand up, read fluently, and ace an entire seminar without having cracked a book the night before. By the time final exams rolled around in December 1826, Poe was the top student in both Latin and French. He even walked away with a certificate of academic excellence. His schedule was a dream. Classes in the morning, free time in the afternoons, and weekends. He was charismatic and quickly gathered a tight circle of friends. His dorm, room 13, a fitting number for the future king of horror, became the designated hangout spot. He was inducted into the university's literary society and even named its secretary. His classmates loved listening to him recite poetry, both the classics and his own drafts. Contrary to John Allan's vision of a miserable brat, his college friends remembered him as an incredibly pleasant, funny guy. A funny guy who was admittedly highly neurotic. The root of that neurosis? Money. John Allan had heard rumors about the wild, debauched lives of college students. To keep Edgar on the straight and narrow, he sent him to the university with exactly $110. $60 went to tuition for 2 semesters. $50 went to room and board. That was it. Not a single cent of walking around money. The problem was that the University of Virginia was the most elite playground in the state. The campus was packed with the spoiled sons of incredibly wealthy plantation owners. They wore tailored suits, smoked premium cigars, and spent their evenings drinking in expensive taverns. Surrounded by this, Edgar felt like a peasant. His pride couldn't take it. Desperate to keep up appearances and put some cash in his pocket, he turned to the card tables. He was a terrible gambler. He lost constantly. By the end of his first semester, he was $2,000 in the hole. In the early 1800s, that was an astronomical sum. You could buy a very nice piece of real estate for $2,000. The debt collectors were circling. Asking John Allan for the money was a death sentence, so Edgar pulled a hustle. He wrote to his foster parents asking them to open a line of credit for his wardrobe, specifically at the most expensive tailors in town. He would buy the luxury clothes on credit, then immediately sell them for cash to pay down his gambling markers. But when a college freshman asks his parents to pay for his 17th winter coat of the season, the illusion shatters. John Allan figured it out. This was also the exact moment Edgar Allan Poe discovered alcohol. A college buddy later noted that Poe's thirst for hard liquor was just as sudden and reckless as his gambling. From the biological father he never really knew, Poe inherited a brutal physiological quirk. He was a disastrous lightweight. One glass of liquor would completely alter his personality. He would go on massive benders and wake up with zero memory of the night before. Yet miraculously, he still managed to finish the year with top honors. Let's pause and look at the psychology here. A father decides, I'm not giving you spending money so you won't get into trouble. It's a beautifully flawed piece of logic. Denying the money doesn't kill the temptation. It just forces the kid to find highly creative, usually destructive ways to get the money. He hit the card tables. If John Allan had just given him an allowance for some cigars and a few rounds at the pub, none of this would have happened. Then again, If Poe hadn't been dragged through the agonizing humiliation of poverty and debt, he probably wouldn't have become the genius we know today. Still, it's a timeless example of how totally disconnected parents can be from their kids' reality. In December 1826, John Allan showed up in Charlottesville and was hit with the reality of the $2,000 gambling debt. The irony is that John had recently inherited a massive fortune. He could have paid the debt out of his pocket change. Instead, he decided to play the moralizing patriarch. He pulled Edgar out of the university. Back in Richmond, the house exploded. John screamed that Edgar was a lazy, ungrateful parasite who hadn't earned a dime in his life. Edgar screamed back that John was a cruel, stingy tyrant. Edgar stormed out and spent the night in a local tavern. A few days later, he fled the state entirely and headed for Boston. It's 1827. Poe is 18 years old and he is flat broke. Desperate for survival money, he convinced a tiny print shop to publish a pamphlet of his poetry titled Tamerlane and Other Poems. It was 40 pages long. They printed exactly 50 copies. They tossed it in the shop window with a price tag of 12 cents. Nobody bought it. It was a total commercial failure. Fast forward 180 years, and one of those surviving 12-cent pamphlets went up for auction at Christie's. It sold for $662,500. Money that the man who wrote it couldn't have even hallucinated during his lifetime. By the spring, the money ran dry. Poe was literally starving. To avoid dying in the street, he enlisted in the United States Army. Shockingly, he was an incredible soldier. He served for 2 years and rose to the rank of Sergeant Major for Artillery, the absolute highest rank an enlisted man could achieve at the time. While he was in uniform, his foster mother, Frances, fell gravely ill. By 1829, she was fading fast. Edgar secured a military leave and rushed back to Richmond. He was too late. They had already buried her. At 20 years old, Edgar Allan Poe became an orphan for the second time, having now lost both the woman who gave birth to him and the woman who actually raised him. Almost immediately after the funeral, John Allan married another woman, a woman he had been secretly seeing for years. He formally recognized the illegitimate children he had already fathered with her and rewrote his will to leave them everything. Edgar's name was completely erased from the estate. John's final act as a guardian was to pull some strings and get Edgar an appointment to the legendary military academy at West Point. Poe crushed the entrance exams. He already had 2 years of hard military service under his belt and figured he'd fast-track his way to becoming an officer. Then he read the fine print he was going to have to sit in a classroom for 4 agonizing years. His enthusiasm evaporated. He hated West Point with a burning passion. He wanted to be a writer. He wanted to work for a magazine, but he couldn't legally resign from the academy without John Allan's signature. So Poe decided to force their hand. He engineered his own court-martial. For months he engaged in spectacular insubordination. He refused to attend formations, openly mocked officers, and showed up to drills looking like a vagrant. There is even a persistent, glorious legend that he once arrived for parade inspection completely naked, wearing nothing but his hat and his leather ammo belt. Naturally, the Army kicked him out. It is 1831. He is 22 years old. He has no degree, no inheritance, no prospects, and absolutely zero money. He can't go back to Richmond, so he heads to Baltimore. He knocks on the door of his Aunt Maria Clem, the sister of his vanished biological father. Maria is living in near poverty with her ailing mother and her young daughter Virginia, who is Edgar's first cousin. Unlike John Allan, Aunt Maria had no grand social ambitions. She didn't lecture Edgar. She didn't judge him. They survived entirely on her mother's meager pension. Edgar looked at his skill set. He knew how to write poems, and he knew how to write stories. He decided he was going to force the world to pay him for it. That year, a Philadelphia newspaper announced a literary contest. Poe bundled up a few short stories and mailed them in, including The Duc de l'Omelette and A Tale of Jerusalem. They weren't masterpieces. They didn't have gripping plots or profound philosophical depths. They were essentially Flex's Poe showing off how smart he was. The Duke story was half written in French, and the Jerusalem story was packed with dense historical details of ancient Judea. He didn't win the prize money, but the paper published them anyway. Critics noticed the raw talent, but the publication paid him in exposure, not cash. The next year he tried again. He sent 6 stories to a new contest, including a piece called M.S. Found in a Bottle. This was a massive leap forward. He meticulously detailed the geography of the South Seas and the mechanical rigging of sailing ships, and then, for the first time, he injected the DNA of what would become his trademark, the supernatural and the slow descent into madness. Best of all, he wrote it in the first person. It made the horror feel uncomfortably real. He took first place. They printed the story, and Edgar Allan Poe held his first real paycheck as a professional writer, $50. The head of the contest jury was a man named John Pendleton Kennedy. He was a lawyer, a politician, and a guy who wrote war novels on the weekends. Kennedy was absolutely floored by this kid's bizarre, hypnotic writing style. He decided to track Poe down and become his patron. He sent a letter inviting the young author to dinner. Poe, the future titan of American letters, wrote back, "Your invitation has wounded me to the quick. I cannot come. The reason is the most humiliating condition of my clothes. If your friendship is genuine, loan me $20 and I will see you tomorrow." Kennedy sent the cash. More than that, he sent Poe a horse so he could ride out to the estate and mandated that Poe join him for dinner regularly. Then Kennedy made the introduction that changed everything. He connected Poe with the owner of the Southern Literary Messenger, a brand new magazine down in Richmond that was desperate for talent. Poe started selling them stories, and finally a trickle of steady money began to flow. And man, did he deliver. Poe's fiction was a shock to the system. The American South was drowning in boring, moralizing, preachy literature. Poe cracked the code on how to make something go viral in the 1830s. First, he realized that America was a baby. The country was barely 50 years old. It had no ancient history. So readers were obsessed with the dark, crumbling castles of the old world Germanic Gothic tales and French romances. Second, he knew that people only talk about things that make them feel extreme emotions: laughter, awe, or pure unfiltered terror. He leaned hard into the terror. He dropped a story called Berenice. It was a Gothic nightmare. The main character's sister falls into a catatonic state, and he becomes obsessively, violently fixated on her teeth. Today we'd call it severe hyperfixation. It escalates until the guy literally breaks into her tomb to rip the teeth out of her skull. It was grotesque, but the prose was undeniably beautiful. Then he pivoted and wrote The Unparalleled Adventure of One Hans Pfaall. It was sci-fi before sci-fi existed. A guy drowning in debt builds a hot air balloon and flies to the moon to escape his creditors. Poe packed the story with hardcore technical data, barometric pressure readings, altitude math, temperature drops. Sure, he imagined the moon was concave and surrounded by breathable ether, but for the 1830s it sounded like cutting-edge science. It was so convincingly written that half the country thought they were reading a leaked government document. This brings us to the second great myth about Edgar Allan Poe, that he was a deeply disturbed, mentally ill man who was naturally obsessed with ripped-out teeth and murder. It's total nonsense. You have to separate the artist from the canvas. Modern scholars agree that Poe was entirely sane. He was just a brilliant marketer. He wanted to write beautiful romantic poetry, but nobody would pay for it. But when he wrote about blood and madness, the public threw money at him. Thanks to his stories, the magazine's popularity exploded. In August 1835, the owner offered him a full-time gig as the assistant editor. Poe packed his bags and moved back to Richmond. Right around this time, a wealthy cousin of the family popped up. He had a very lucrative law practice and offered to take young Virginia off Aunt Maria's hands. The girl was 13. She needed an education and a stable roof. Aunt Maria thought it was a great deal and wrote to Edgar to tell him the news. Poe had an absolute psychological meltdown. On September 29th, 1835, Aunt Maria received a letter from Richmond that was physically blistered with tears. Poe wrote that Virginia was the only reason he drew breath, and that if Maria sent her away, he would put a bullet in his own head. He begged his aunt to pack up the house and move to Richmond with him. He promised a promotion was coming and swore he could provide for them. They agreed. In May of 1836, Edgar Allan Poe married his 13-year-old first cousin. Poe's life is buried in mythology, but this part is a glaring, uncomfortable truth. By any modern metric, it's highly disturbing. He essentially bullied a young girl into walking away from a financially secure future to live with him. But by all historical accounts, he was devotedly, intensely in love with her. There is a strong consensus among historians that the marriage was never physically consummated, backed up by the fact that they never had children. Given that they were both destined for tragic early graves, maybe that was for the best. Professionally, Poe was crushing it. He was promoted to editor-in-chief of the Southern Literary Messenger with a salary of $15 a week. That was solid middle-class money. He could rent a nice house, keep the lights on, and actually put some away in the bank. The magazine was a beast. 64 pages of tiny print dropping every single month. It had 3 sections. Part 1, Modern Fiction and Poetry. Part 2, Cutting-Edge Science and Tech. Astronomy, the invention of the telegraph, and wild travel logs from explorers heading out west or deep into Europe. Part 3, the literary criticism section. There's a myth that Poe ran this magazine single-handedly. He didn't. He had a stable of Southern lawyers, politicians, and gentlemen writers contributing. But the owner of the magazine had a bad habit of letting his rich, untalented friends publish their awful poetry in the pages. Poe was disgusted by amateur hour. He would take a red pen and absolutely slaughter their submissions. He'd delete entire paragraphs, rewrite their rhymes, and change their endings, all without asking their permission. If the owner explicitly ordered him not to edit a VIP's terrible poem, Poe would print it and then flip to the criticism section at the back of the magazine and brutally roast the exact same poem. It's actually a genius move. Get paid to publish the trash, then get paid to destroy it 5 pages later. That criticism section became his weapon. In the 1830s, American literature was a joke. Washington Irving was the only guy making waves. Nobody took James Fenimore Cooper's frontier stories seriously yet. Because the country desperately needed its own cultural identity the way we view blockbuster movies today, magazines would blindly praise any American writer out of sheer patriotism. Poe refused to play that game. He was hyper-educated and instantly recognized when a wealthy American writer was just plagiarizing a European novel. He especially despised what he called the New York literary mafia, a cabal of editors who took bribes to write glowing reviews for rich kids pretending to be authors. In the December issue, Poe aimed his crosshairs at a New York publisher named Theodore Fay, who had just released a novel called Norman Leslie. Poe didn't just review it, he vivisected it. He broke down the awful grammar, highlighted the pathetic character arcs, and humiliated the author on a molecular level. His boss was terrified. He complained that Poe was a rogue agent, too cynical, too vicious. He hated that his young editor was treating the magazine like his own personal fiefdom. But the readers were addicted. They bought the magazine just to see who Poe was going to execute next. In a single year, the circulation skyrocketed from 500 copies to 5,000. But karma is a boomerang. Theodore Fay's newspaper, the New York Mirror, launched a smear campaign against Poe. They painted him as a bitter, provincial, alcoholic loser who was just jealous of New York elite money. The tragedy was that they were half right. Poe was drinking heavily again. He was self-medicating to handle the stress of carrying the magazine, fighting with his boss managing his family, and agonizing over the fact that he was surrounded by terrible writers. He was also burning the midnight oil, writing his only full-length novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. The sheer volume of work broke him. Right before New Year's Day, 1837, Poe vanished into a multi-day blackout bender. He was supposed to be locking the January issue for the printers, and he just never showed up to the office. If you've ever worked in publishing, you know January is the most brutal deadline of the year. Everyone else is drinking eggnog, and you're chained to a desk trying to close a book. I get why he cracked, but his boss didn't care. He fired him. Poe rang in his 28th birthday unemployed. He had a half-finished manuscript, a family to feed, and a bruised ego. In February, they packed up and moved to New York City. 2 weeks later, the entire American economy imploded. For half a century, the Southern economy was built entirely on the back of free slave labor and cotton. By the 1830s, the South was churning out 3.5 million tons of cotton a year. Plantation owners took out massive loans against crops that hadn't even been planted yet. New York brokers chopped up that debt and sold it globally. But by early 1837, the global market realized there was way too much cotton and not enough demand. The price plummeted by 50%. In March, the biggest cotton firm in the country defaulted. The New York brokers collapsed. Panic set in. Paper money became worthless. Publishing houses and newspapers shuttered their doors overnight. Poe and his family fled to Philadelphia, hoping to find scraps of work. For the next 2 years, he took whatever gig he could find. He worked for a time at Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, fought with the owner, quit, sold random freelance stories, and even wrote a textbook about seashells just to buy groceries. They were living on the razor's edge of starvation. But isolation breeds brilliance. Without the grind of a daily editorial desk, Poe sat in a cheap room and hammered out the foundation of modern dark fiction. He wrote The Fall of the House of Usher, William Wilson, and The Devil in the Belfry. In December 1839, he finally published his first real collection, Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, and he got screwed again. The publisher printed a tiny run and kept 100% of the profits. Poe's payment was a few free copies of his own book. It didn't sell well anyway. By now, Poe was famous in the industry, and the national papers reviewed the book. Some critics praised his wild imagination, comparing him to the great English romantics. But the New York critics, the ones Poe had spent years publicly castrating, smelled blood in the water. They called the book pointless, ugly, and deranged. They had waited years for him to slip up, and they unloaded the clip. The most prophetic review came from a Boston paper, which stated that this kind of weird dark fiction would probably only be understood by readers in the distant future. They were right. Today, Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque is considered the bedrock of psychological horror. What 1830s critics called a fever dream, modern scholars call a surgical examination of human trauma. Needing a steady paycheck, Poe went back to the magazine grind, eventually landing at Graham's Magazine. It was here in 1841 that he dropped the nuke. He published The Murders in the Rue Morgue. He literally invented the detective genre. I remember reading that story growing up before the golden age of slasher films when true horror was hard to find. I was maybe 12 years old. Without spoiling too much, though the statute of limitations on a 180-year-old story has definitely passed, the killer in Paris turns out to be an escaped orangutan. The way Poe described the bodies, the way the ape shoved a victim up a chimney, it was viscerally terrifying. I was genuinely scared to turn the lights out. With that one short story, Poe wrote the rule book that Hollywood still uses today. Rule 1. Treat the crime scene like a locked room puzzle. Give the reader the clues and let them race the detective to the finish line. Rule 2. Invent an eccentric, impossibly smart investigator. Poe created C. Auguste Dupin, a guy who despises regular cops and solves crimes purely through hyper-logical deduction. Decades later, Arthur Conan Doyle would lift this exact blueprint to create Sherlock Holmes. Conan Doyle openly admitted he worshipped Poe's detective stories. Rule 3. Tell the story from the perspective of the detective's slightly slower, totally average best friend. Poe's narrator was the prototype for Dr. Watson. It gives the genius an excuse to explain his brilliant deductions out loud to the audience. Poe wrote 2 more Dupin mysteries. In 1842, he published The Mystery of Marie Roget, launching the armchair detective trope, where the genius never even visits the crime scene and solves it just by reading the newspapers. Agatha Christie would later use this exact framework for Miss Marple. Finally, in 1844, he wrote The Purloined Letter. No murders, no blood, just a corrupt politician hiding a blackmail letter in plain sight. And Dupin figuring it out by stepping into the psychological shoes of the criminal. It was the birth of criminal profiling and the spy thriller. America went crazy for the detective stories. Graham's magazine exploded to a circulation of 40,000, a staggering number for the era. Poe was finally a recognized A-list writer. But there is a final myth about Poe, that every other writer in America despised him. Actually, that one is completely true, and it was entirely his own fault. If you thought his reviews in the 1830s were mean, his later work was merciless. In the late 1840s, he published a series of essays called The Literati of New York City. It was 37 separate hit pieces on the biggest authors in the country. He didn't just critique their grammar, he mocked their faces, their manners, and even the way they physically wrote their letters. Here is what he wrote about the founder of the Broadway Journal, a guy who had actually hired Poe multiple times. In his whole life, he has never written 3 consecutive sentences in correct English. He is blatantly illiterate and blatantly uneducated. About another famous poet, he wrote, "His sincerity is his only redeeming trait, and his prejudice is absolute. His verses possess all the elegance of a heavily loaded draft horse." He published these burns in a women's magazine called Godey's Ladies' Book. The editor was so terrified of lawsuits that he printed a giant disclaimer essentially saying, "We don't agree with Poe. Please don't sue us." The New York writers didn't sue, they went to war. It was a 19th century media bloodbath. Papers ran vicious cartoons of Poe exaggerating his nose. They published rumors that he was a con artist who borrowed money and skipped town. They accused him of beating his wife, which was a complete lie. But the man who delivered the fatal blow was a critic named Rufus Griswold. Poe had publicly humiliated Griswold for years, calling his column a flea market where writers trade fake compliments. Griswold was the king of the paid review hustle. He had taken Poe's money for a review once and then printed a sarcastic insult instead. Griswold never forgot the feud. After Poe died, Griswold somehow managed to get himself appointed as the executor of Poe's literary estate. He got the keys to the kingdom. Griswold wrote Poe's first official biography, deliberately cherry-picking out-of-context letters to paint Poe as a drug-addicted, immoral lunatic. That lie became the accepted truth for nearly a century. But let's get back to the timeline of his life because the darkest chapter was about to begin. It's a January evening in 1842. Poe is hosting friends at his house. His young wife, Virginia, is playing the piano and singing. Suddenly, she stops. She covers her mouth and blood spills through her fingers. Tuberculosis. The exact same disease that slowly suffocated his mother. Poe's reality shattered. He had watched his mother die. He had watched his foster mother die. Now the universe was coming for his wife. The sheer dread broke him and he spiraled into the worst drinking binges of his life. Was Poe a clinical alcoholic? The historical consensus is complicated. He wasn't a daily drinker. He could go a year or 2 without touching a drop. But when he did drink, his brain chemistry betrayed him. One glass acted like a tripwire, sending him into days-long blackouts. He wrote about it himself. I became insane with long intervals of horrible sanity. During these fits of absolute unconsciousness, I drank God only knows how much or how long. As a matter of course, my enemies referred the insanity to the drink rather than the drink to the insanity. Asterisk. In 1845, as he watched his wife slowly waste away, he published a poem called The Raven. It is his undisputed masterpiece. A man sitting alone in a dark room, grieving a dead woman, visited by a demonic bird. The man asks the bird if he will ever forget her. He asks if he will see her in heaven. He asks if the pain will ever stop. And the universe, in the form of the raven, gives him a one-word answer: nevermore. It is the peak of tragic Gothic literature. There is no silver lining, no redemption, just an incredibly rhythmic, hypnotic descent into permanent grief. Virginia's illness dragged on for 5 agonizing years. Poe knew she was dying, and while he loved her deeply, the stress and his growing fame led to some messy situations. He started receiving fan mail from women across the country. He engaged in a heavy, highly public, flirtatious correspondence with a poet named Frances Osgood. Virginia actually gave them her blessing. She knew she was dying, and she likely wanted Edgar to have someone to catch him when she was gone. But a third woman entered the chat. Elizabeth Elliot, another writer, became obsessively jealous of the relationship between Poe and Osgood. She wanted the spotlight. She showed up at Poe's house, confronted the dying Virginia, and demanded to see the private letters, claiming she was just protecting his moral reputation. When Poe kicked her out, she sent her brother to physically assault him. It was Elliot who first started planting stories in the press that Poe had lost his mind. Poe wrote, "Hell hath no fury like a scorned woman. I rejected Mrs. Elliot, and to this day she has not ceased her persecutions." The stress of the public scandal accelerated Virginia's decline. In January 1847, she finally died. Poe was hollowed out, but the terrible waiting game was over. Slowly, he crawled out of the dark. He decided he needed to marry again to stabilize his life. A year later, he sparked a romance with a wealthy, eccentric, 45-year-old poet named Sarah Helen Whitman. She was heavily into the occult, hosted seances, and claimed she could talk to ghosts. Poe proposed to her on their second date. She said yes, but on one strict condition: he could never touch a drop of alcohol again. The wedding was set for December 1848, but a few days before the ceremony, someone, likely one of his many enemies, tipped her off that Poe had been seen drinking at a tavern. She immediately called off the wedding. A year later, Poe got word that his very first teenage love, Sarah Royster, was now a wealthy widow in Richmond. He rode down, knocked on her door, and proposed. This time, John Allen wasn't around to ruin it. She said yes. By the summer of 1849, things were looking up. The grief was fading. He was sober. He was about to launch his own national magazine called The Stylus. He planned a massive lecture tour to raise the capital. He was moving his Aunt Maria back from New York to live with them. He was about to marry his childhood sweetheart. He was 40 years old, and he was finally about to win. Then he vanished. Let's trace his final steps. On September 26, 1849, Poe is in Richmond. He's prepping for his lecture tour. He drops by the office of his friend, Dr. John Carter, to talk business. He leaves, has dinner at a restaurant, and runs into some acquaintances. They all testify that he was completely sober, in great spirits, and promised he'd be back in town soon. At 4 a.m. on September 27th, he boards a steamer ship bound for Baltimore. For the next 5 days, Edgar Allan Poe ceases to exist on the historical record. On October 3rd, Joseph Walker finds him in the mud outside Ryan's Tavern. His luggage is gone. He is wearing cheap, filthy clothes that don't belong to him. He is rushed to the Washington Medical College. The attending physician, Dr. John Joseph Moran, notes that Poe does not smell of liquor. He is completely incoherent. He can't explain where he's been or whose clothes he's wearing. Soon the confusion spirals into violent hallucinations. On October 6th, his cousin tries to visit him, but the hospital turns him away, saying the patient is too manic. At 5 a.m. on Sunday, October 7th, 1849, the fever breaks. Poe goes totally calm. He stares at the ceiling, whispers, "Lord, help my poor soul," and dies. Everything we know about those final hours comes strictly from the notes of Dr. Moran, and historians do not trust Dr. Moran. After Poe's death, Moran realized he was sitting on a gold mine. He wrote a book about Poe's final days and spent the rest of his life touring the country giving paid lectures about watching the genius die. Every year his story got a little more dramatic, a little more embellished. On the official death certificate, Moran wrote phrenitis, inflammation of the brain. In the 1840s, doctors regularly used that term as a polite cover-up for an alcohol overdose, to spare the family the embarrassment. But Moran swore until his dying day that Poe had not been drinking. There was no autopsy. The cause of death remained a blank page. It's been over 170 years, and modern science is still trying to solve the final mystery of the man who invented the mystery genre. Theory 1. Delirium tremens, the classic alcohol withdrawal. It explains the hallucinations, the memory loss, and the fatal brain swelling. His peers assumed this was the truth, but again, the doctor explicitly stated he didn't smell a drop of booze on him. Theory 2. The flu or cholera. Baltimore had just suffered a massive cholera outbreak. Days before leaving Richmond, Poe complained of a fever and chills. Did a bad flu turn into fatal pneumonia on a cold boat ride? Maybe. But that doesn't explain why his luggage vanished, why he was dumped in a gutter, or why he was wearing a stranger's clothes. Theory 3. Murder. Sarah Helen Whitman, the woman who canceled their wedding, had 3 brothers. They violently hated Poe and viewed him as a broke alcoholic parasite. Did they ambush him in Baltimore, beat him mercilessly, steal his clothes to humiliate him, and leave him for dead? It's possible. But beating a man takes 5 minutes. Where was he for 5 days? Furthermore, the engagement had been broken off for months. The motive was already dead. Theory 4. Rabies. In 1996, a cardiologist in Maryland ran a blind diagnostic test. He was handed an anonymous patient file containing Poe's final symptoms and asked to diagnose the cause of death. The doctor concluded that the patient died of classic late-stage rabies. The symptoms match perfectly periods of violent mania followed by exhaustion and extreme hydrophobia. Dr. Moran's notes specifically stated that Poe violently refused to drink even a sip of water. It's a brilliant medical deduction, but once again, it doesn't explain the stolen clothes. Theory 5. The Cooping Plot. In the late 1840s, Baltimore politics were run by violent street gangs. On election days, these gangs would kidnap homeless men or out-of-towners. They would drug them or force alcohol down their throats, lock them in a basement, a coop, and then drag them from polling station to polling station, forcing them to vote for a specific corrupt politician over and over again. To avoid the poll workers recognizing the victim, the gangs would constantly change the victim's clothes, shave their beards, or swap their hats. This theory hits every single nail on the head. First, Ryan's Tavern was an active polling station that exact day. Second, it perfectly explains why Poe was found delirious wearing clothes that weren't his. The physical trauma and forced alcohol poisoning over several days in a freezing basement simply stopped his heart. We will likely never know the truth, but even in death the drama didn't stop. 2 days after his funeral, the New York Daily Tribune ran an obituary. It read, "Edgar Allan Poe is dead. He died in Baltimore the day before yesterday. This announcement will startle many, but few will be grieved by it. It was signed, Ludwig." Ludwig was Rufus Griswold the critic, with the bruised ego executing his final revenge. He successfully painted Poe as a monster, but Griswold misunderstood human nature. The darker the myth, the more people want to read the books. Poe's sales exploded. His true global resurrection, however, happened in France. The poet Charles Baudelaire read Poe's work and was so paralyzed by its dark beauty that he spent 14 years translating it into French. Baudelaire and the French symbolists declared Poe a god. From Paris, his fame bounced back to London and then swept across Russia. In 1861, Fyodor Dostoevsky personally translated Poe's stories and published them in his own magazine, heavily influencing the psychological depth of Crime and Punishment. The great Russian poet Konstantin Balmont spent 12 years translating Poe's verses. When asked about the scandals, the drinking, and the rumors that haunted Poe's legacy, Balmont gave the perfect epitaph. He said, "I believe that geniuses like Edgar Allan Poe exist far above our accusations or our justifications. They are as distant from us as the planet Mars. You can look up and try to explain the red light of the planet, but trying to accuse it or justify it is simply ridiculous." Before we wrap up, a quick piece of trivia. I told you about the murders in the Rue Morgue. There has never been a Rue Morgue in Paris. Poe completely made it up. He never even set foot in France. But in 1928, the city of Paris officially named a street in his honor, Rue Edgar Allan Poe. I mentioned the brutal reality of the mid-1800s in this episode. If you haven't watched our deep dive into the untold stories of the Civil War, you need to check that out next on the channel. Thank you for riding shotgun through history with us. If you aren't subscribed yet, hit that button and make sure you ring the bell so you don't miss a single story. We're pulling a lot more out of the archives soon. Thanks for watching.